would love to have you introduce us to you as a writer. What have you written? What does your writing career look like so far? Just help us get to know you as a contributing author for Cost of Living.
So, I've been writing and getting published pretty consistently since 2021. My first acceptance for a paid publication was in 2020. I primarily write horror, but I also write science fiction, fantasy. I have a job as a ghostwriter writing romance. Though I prefer science fiction, fantasy, LGBTQ, that kind of thing. I had a lot of short stories published. I have not yet had a book published, but I'm working on that. Yeah, that's kind of the big points here for me.
Cool. What long form fiction are you working on? What book are you working on?
I have one project that I would like to keep a little under wraps because I'm not quite ready to announce it until I have the it's an anthology and I'm not quite ready to announce it until I have it all written out. And aside from that, I'm mostly just querying novels that I have every once in a while and sending out a lot of short fiction too. I have like a monthly list that I maintain on my notes app of just different anthologies. I mostly use the horror tree. And so I just send out everything I can and have found some success that way.
As an addition to helping us get to know you as a contributing author, what are you reading right now? I hesitate to ask about favorites, but what are you enjoying a lot these days?
So currently I am reading The Dead Take the A Train by Cassandra Khaw.
I
I'm
like
listening to an audiobook, so I need to look up the other author. I mostly was reading it for Cassandra Khaw. Richard Kadri, and I'm really enjoying that one. I'm also reading Gideon the Ninth by Tamsin Muir, the Lost Tomb trilogy. I listen to a lot of audiobooks. I just finished A.M. Shine's The Watchers just in time for the movie to come out. I've been reading some Terry Pratchett too along the way, which is also always very fun too. He's a great writer.
I'll be curious to hear what you think about the movie The Watchers. I saw that this week.
I liked it overall. I thought it was well shot and many of the changes made sense. Some of the characterization and some of the desperation that the characters had didn't quite connect on the screen. Like the fact that all the characters were starving by the end of it. It didn't really show on the big screen. They could have obviously I don't want actors to be dangerously underweight for their roles, but they could have done makeup or something to make it clearer that they were starving and dirty and miserable. And I feel like they should have made the character of Madeline, a bit meaner, because that inhuman aspect to her really helped sell the plot twist in the story. She was a lot nicer in the movie, and I kind of get why, because of the time constraints of a movie versus a book. When you have a book, it's easier to have unlikable characters that are more complex than where you kind of have the whose side is she really on thing. It's a little harder in a movie,
right?
Have that kind of complexity of whose side is she really on? Is she going to help them, or is she just going to abandon them after a certain point because their survival is the only thing that matters? But yeah, overall though, I liked it.
Other stuff you might recommend? Do you have a list of authors where when they put out a book, you will go get that book right away?
Neil Gaiman. I've enjoyed a lot of Grady Hendrix's work and a lot of Haley Piper's work.
I wonder if you could introduce us a bit to your story, and we don't want to spoil it for readers, but for those who have already read it, who are interested in our anthology and want to just know, this is kind of their opportunity to peek behind the scenes and see what the author had in mind. What inspired you to write your story? And it was called Hoodlums, right?
Yes, it was called Hoodlums, and I won't spoil the twist, but it's about an HOA president who is having a gang problem in her neighborhood. But as you're reading it, it's kind of clear that it's mostly just people trying to mind their own business. I will say that it is inspired by real life in a lot of ways. Or my experiences in my own neighborhood. I still live with my parents, and so occasionally my mom will talk about the complaints that our neighbors have leveled about, oh, these darn teenagers coming from outside of the neighborhood to play basketball on the playground and stuff.
Yeah.
And I'm like, really? Are you really that worried about some kids playing outside in a fairly safe neighborhood, minding their own business? And I've noticed too, like there's a point where they talk about the tennis courts getting locked up, except for those who know the password to get in. And that is something that has happened in my neighborhood. I don't know if they still have it, but yeah, you can't access it without a password now. And this was something that when I was in elementary, middle school, this is the house I grew up in for the most part. We were allowed to go inside the tennis courts and play, even if we weren't technically playing tennis. We'd still be allowed to play in there as like middle schoolers and elementary schoolers and stuff. And I have like a memory of one of my friends. She had this dog that she was a half Newfoundland, half poodle, the dumbest dog I've ever met. She just wasn't very smart, not a very smart animal. And so but we let her run around the tennis court for a bit just to get some of her energy out because she was a puppy, but she was like a giant puppy. I don't think you'd be allowed to do that in the tennis courts today, which I find kind of ridiculous, if no one else is currently using it.
My kids were told to stop letting the dog run in the tennis court.
Yeah. Maybe not the best example. I'm just saying that was a thing that happened. Like this is something that happened like 10 years ago. If they aren't doing any property damage and are just outside having fun with their friends, even if it's not that every person is in the neighborhood, like I've had neighbors call the police on teenagers who are just playing basketball in the neighborhood. And because they aren't from the neighborhood or whatever. And I'm like, how do you know that? And it could be that they're with their friends and one of the friends lives in the neighborhood and it's just a group there. As you can see, I have strong opinions on this kind of thing. And so the story I was writing was kind of making fun of this attitude because
that fear of the outsider kind of overreaction thing.
Yeah. Like it's the same people will then on the same breath of complaining about these darn kids today playing basketball in a public area on there, they'll be complaining that kids are always on their phones, not doing anything. And I'm like, well, what do you want them to do if they're going to get harassed by the cops for daring to play basketball or something? What else do they have aside from their phones? So it's kind of, like I said, a lot of it is kind of about that, in my opinion, ridiculous attitude there.
Yeah, a lot of cost of living consists of stories that take those everyday experiences of people reacting out of fear or misunderstanding of one another and then ratcheting that up to put it on display. And for some reason, when we see it kind of taken to its logical conclusion, it makes it sometimes easier to understand the criticism of that behavior or that fear, or just kind of puts it on display so the reader can draw their own conclusions. It doesn't need to be, it's not preachy, it just is like a demonstration of what happens when we take this fear to its logical conclusion, and it can get pretty out of hand pretty quickly.
Yeah.
And I loved your story, so I appreciated that you sent it. I really appreciate your perspective. I appreciate also that you're willing to talk about the inspiration for it, so thanks for that. My next question is, I'll preface it by saying, when we tell people that we read a lot of horror or we write horror, sometimes they get an idea in their head of a specific kind of thing, and rather than tell them that they're mistaken, I often just find it beneficial to tell them what I think of as horror. And I wonder if you could describe for us, if you have like a working definition of horror as a genre concept, like what does that word, what does that category mean for you?
Creating fear and suspense, magnifying, sort of holding a funhouse mirror up to society. That's what I tend to think of when I think of horror. I have a little bit of a hot take though. Horror and comedy to me are less genres and more tones and atmospheres. I struggle to think of something that I could define as a straight horror story in the same way that I can define a straight science fiction story or a straight fantasy story. It's something that blends well with all other genres. Like I would call my story a sort of domestic horror in a way. It's a story about a very something that on the surface is very mundane, but then it gets into the darkness underneath the mundanity of, you know, nosy HOA ladies who don't know how to mind their own business. And so I think that a lot of horror is holding up that funhouse mirror, and play like in a way that like comedy kind of undercuts the maybe not the seriousness of it, but shows it from a different perspective in a way. It's maybe like a prism or something, like how a prism bends light to separate it out into a rainbow. That's sort of what horror and comedy do. I would argue that my story is kind of darkly comic too. Bends the light so that you can better see the makeup of the light or the image.
It's interesting as I'm reading through for editing purposes all of these stories that are in our collection. There are very few that don't get legitimate, like out loud chuckles, at least, because it is they are funny because it is kind of an absurdity. It's like showing the absurdity of these mundane situations and really bringing that to light. And so that there's kind of a thin line between I'm frightened and I think this is hilarious. And I do appreciate the stories that walk the line between this is so absurd I'm laughing and this is so absurd I'm terrified.
To me, that's why horror and comedy work so well together too, is for that reason. Only difference between horror and comedy is what the punchline is. Comedy punchlines make you laugh. Horror, the punchline makes you scream.
Yeah. I like that. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder where you found our call for submissions. And then for those who are watching or listening who didn't see the original call, it asks for suburban psychological or social horror and then gives some kind of examples. And I wonder what drew you to that call for submissions. And personally, I'm just curious how you found us, because I know we're not a big deal we're the least big deal of all the not big deals, because we're brand new. Whisper House Press is a new entity. And yeah, so what drew you to it?
I found you through the horror tree, which I kind of mentioned earlier. You know how they have their calendar function there? What I do
It's
at the
great.
beginning of every month is I collect up the deadlines for that month. And a lot of times I have things that are like things in my trunk that are just they're written, ready to be sent out, and other things that I'd have to write for in the anthology and stuff. Yours, I did have yours Hoodlums was one that I did have ready to go already. I'd sent it out a few times and gotten a couple no's, but this is why as writers I'm telling you this too as a kind of don't give up thing, because you never know. If you get a no on one story, the next person might love it, and so
Right.
you just have to keep sending things out. To me, that's the hard part of one of the, like, you after a certain point you get used to it, but the hard part is like the fact that you have to get used to constantly being rejected and stuff.
Yeah.
And now it doesn't really faze me. I'm like, oh, bummer, move on. Put that back in the trunk for later. And then the other side of it is to send out as much as you can. Like now I'm getting into writing advice, but or getting
Well, that's
published.
good. That's part of the reason I asked the question, because I'm thinking if there's a newer writer, somebody who has never submitted their stories anywhere before, it's helpful to know where the writers who are getting published are looking and how they're thinking about how they're approaching it. So that's super helpful.
Yes. So the horror tree, definitely recommended. It's probably the best resource I found. I use it all the time. It's my sort of my default for checking open calls and stuff. Partly the reason why I write so much horror too, now that I think about it. But I love the, and that's not saying I don't love the genre, because I do. But it kind of, that's where the open calls are. So that's sort of where it directs me. as well. And it's a very useful resource. Another one that as a resource is Authors Publish. It's a newsletter that goes out pretty much every day, and it collects, like, aggregates different open calls for anthologies and novels and novellas and like the kinds of things that they're looking for. And that one's also pretty handy to have too.
I'm so glad you mentioned that one. It's definitely one that I don't think about as much because I don't physically have to go to the website to find it. So it's kind of a passive, I just receive that list, but I pay attention to it as well. I also really appreciate that you mentioned that mindset thing about we just have to understand we're going to get a lot of rejections. And I think that a really common misconception among not just starting writers, but let's say like after we've been doing it a little while, we still might have this idea that if we get rejected, it's because the story wasn't good. And I would love to be able to rid that, just dispense with that entirely, because now, especially now, sitting on the other side of the submission table, and I've been submitting for years and have gotten so many dozens of rejections and a couple of yeses. I maybe have like 3 or 4 yeses basically. And being on the other side of it, what I see is that 3 categories of stories that I received. One was this person didn't read the call and it seems to have nothing to do with what's going on, and those get an immediate no. But then there are like 2 other categories. One is like, this is a good story and some version of this book might include this story, but it's not the one that we're actually developing. And then the other one is, this is a good story, and it just so happens, almost by luck, in effect, that this story just so happens to be a really great fit for the collection. And that category is so narrow that I ended up rejecting over 100 stories that could have gone into a book of similar quality and length, etc. But because of the thing that we're actually developing as it's turning out, and the stories that I receive shape what other ones I can accept. So now I'm getting this picture of it from the other side that suggests that the writer has so very little to do. Like, once the story is pretty decent, the writer has very little to do with the luck of does it fit exactly or not. And we can do a little bit to tinker with. We hope that it fits better or rather than worse, but so much of it is out of our hands that I appreciate that idea that we need a different mindset, that we just need to keep sending stuff out, try to figure out what thing matches the thing we've written. But boy, is it not about the quality of the story most of the time. Really.
Yeah, I got 10 rejections before I even got my very first acceptance in like December 2020. So the book didn't come out till like 2021. And some of the rejections, like, I had a couple really encouraging ones that were like, I really enjoyed the story. I thought it was great. It just wasn't a good fit for our anthology this month. But please send in more stuff. And then there was some that were like, I just wasn't feeling it. I thought which like could be harsh, but I actually thought it was kind of funny because it was the same publishing company that I'd sent like something to their newsletter and something to their monthly thing. And so the one that was like their bigger anthology was the one that was like super sweet about it. Then the other one was just like, I just wasn't feeling it. Like, okay, well, I appreciate the honesty there. So yeah, you can't let those get you down either. There's this. Have you watched BoJack Horseman?
I have not.
Okay, well, there's this character named Diane. She is a writer. And they were flashing back to when she first moved to LA, and she was cheering and excited. And they're like, well, what's going on? And she said, I'm reading this rejection letter from the New Yorker out loud. And they're like, and it's like, despite your work having obvious merit, we decided we wouldn't go with it this month. And she goes, and they're like, well, you got rejected. Why are you cheering? And she says, because they said it had obvious merit and stuff. And I'm like, yeah, that's the writer experience right there.
Yeah.
we take what we can get sometimes.
Yeah, we have to.
Yeah.
So I have just a couple of closing questions here. One is, what's next for you? Realizing that this YouTube video probably won't come out until at least 9 months from now. What do you have in mind? What are your goals for the coming year? And if there's any other place that our readers might find you, where could we find you?
My goals in general are to send out as much as I can, because that's been working for me so far. I've been working. I have some like things that I mentioned earlier that are I'm kind of keeping under wraps, but are exciting. I hope to get a novel published at some point in the next year or so. Yeah, mostly just keeping on doing what I'm doing since it seems to be working so far. And
Do you have like a
hopefully
set number of stories that you're trying to submit every month? Like, do you give yourself that kind of a goal?
Yes. So the way that I do it is it's not necessarily a set number of stories, but as many as the horror tree offers for the most part. Like at the
Gotcha.
end of the month, whatever deadline is set at the end of the month, I'm like, so I average maybe about 30, sending out 30 a month or something.
That's
And
amazing.
most of those are rejected. So yeah, it's not that I've written 30 stories in a month. A lot of them are trunk stories that I send out just because I've accumulated a lot of short stories that I've written for other anthologies that sometimes would fit. Like if they are asking just for a general dark fiction thing, I can send out pretty much anything I want. Sometimes like
Right.
yours, I'm lucky enough to have a very similar, like the open call was a little bit different for the other one, for the one that where I originally sent it, but like it just happened to fit almost perfectly with your anthology. So I do send out a lot, as much as I possibly can.
Cool.
And some of my like ghostwriting that I've been doing, I haven't been like it hasn't been 30 every month, sometimes, more or less depending, but yeah, it's kind of my goal is to keep up with that because it's worked
Cool.
so far.
That's a great goal, and I love that it is something that you have control over.
Mm.
We can only control what we do. I have a friend in town, Brian Young, who has published a ton. And one of the piece of advice he gives everybody at the start of the year when it's like goal setting time is like set the goal based on what you can do. Like we can't say I'm going to publish X number of stories, but we can say I'm going to try to write a story every month or 2 stories every month, or I'm going to submit
Mm.
5 stories every month. That's something that we have control over. And it's something that is we can set to be achievable for us.
Someone once said, their goal was to get 100 rejections. And then half the time when they get 100 rejections, it's like it takes longer because their stories keep getting accepted and stuff. So that works too.
Okay.
Yeah. So it was a pleasure talking to you.
Likewise. Thank you so much for your time.